So I am so pleased to welcome everybody to this second installment of NCFS in Captivity. You have come from far and wide, from Paris, from the UK, from all over the country, undergraduates and graduate students and colleagues and historians and literary scholars and art historians. So we're so pleased to have you all here with us today. This is our monthly book series in which colleagues discuss a recent publication, and you can find the complete schedule for the year on the 19th-Century French Studies website. I want to thank my co-organizers, Masha Belenky and Susan McCready, without whom today would not be possible. This series, as many of you know, was born of the current circumstances as a way to compensate for the extreme grief we are feeling, in particular for the postponement of the 2020 conference, which will now take place in Washington, D.C. in fall 2021. You can insert your apocalyptic caveats of your choice there, but I do hope to see you all there. But given the amount of interest in the series and our great numbers today, we believe this might be one of those pandemic things we'll want to keep around. So stay tuned for that. We will keep expanding the schedule, and please do continue to keep us up to date with your recent books or recommendations at ncfsbookseries@gmail.com. So Pratima Prasad is an associate professor of French and an associate dean in the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. She is the author of Colonialism, Race, and the French Romantic Imagination from 2009. In addition to several article-length writings, she has published 2 co-edited books. The first explores the links between the novel and drama in 19th-century France. The second is a PMLA volume on approaches to teaching Georges Sand's Indiana. In her current research, she examines how the Indian Ocean has been imagined and mythologized in French and Francophone writings of the 18th and 19th centuries, and uncovers the literary history of the French Indian Ocean during the July monarchy. Her most recent publication is entitled Esclaves marins à Bourbon from 2020, a scholarly anthology of 19th century novels and short stories about marronage in the reunion island of the Indian Ocean. And now a special welcome to Robin Mitchell, Associate Professor of History at the California State University Channel Islands. She received her master's degree in late modern European history from the University of California, Santa Cruz, and her doctorate in late modern European history from the University of California, Berkeley, with a designated emphasis in women, gender, and sexuality. Her dissertation investigated the correlation between representations of Black women in France and the aftermath of the Haitian Revolution. In addition to numerous published journal articles, Professor Mitchell's first book, which we are here to discuss today, is entitled Vénus Noire, Black Women and Colonial Fantasies in 19th Century France. It was just published with the University of Georgia Press in January of 2020, and you can procure yourself a copy if you don't have it already. With the coupon code, which Masha is going to put in the chat, it's 08VNoir20, and if you purchase it directly from University of Georgia Press, you can get that discount code. So before turning it over, I wanted to say it's been my dream for a long time to bring historians to our conference because there's so much overlap between our work, and this is an absolutely perfect way to start. And I just in terms of how the rest of today will go, Robin is going to speak about her book, and Pratima will be asking questions. Feel free to drop your own questions in the chat at any point. We will try to get to them. And at the end, after we're done with the discussion, anyone who wants to can stick around the Zoom, turn the cameras back on, and we will do our best to have some kind of post-event virtual reception where we can chat more informally, just as we did in the beginning. So over to you.
Robin, do you want to first start off by talking about your book, and or would you like me to start?
I can start out by doing that. First of all, I'd like to say thanks so much for having me, and thanks for so many people for coming. Shout out to the folks abroad, especially for coming today. So the book looks at the appropriation and production of Black female bodies in 19th century France and attempts to show how these bodies help talk about what was represented as a sort of crushing defeat of what would become Haiti. So the defeat that I talk about is represented, normally when we hear people talk about the Haitian Revolution, when we have them talk about revolution in general, it's represented as sort of a masculine space. And so I wanted to see how the defeat in the Haitian Revolution helped fuel a certain type of fantasy about a colony lost, and also helped white French men and women imagine a new identity after the revolution's end. So in some ways, the book is looking at the people, looking at Black women, and then using those Black women's bodies and voices to create a new type of Frenchness. But because the women that I talk about are real, I also needed to show, first of all, what white contemporaries knew about or thought they knew about these women at the time. Because I wanted to highlight the lengths that they would go to manipulate these bodies. And not only manipulate them, but to produce them. So I chose 3 particularly visible women during the time who loomed large on the French landscape in the beginning to mid-19th century. Sarah Bartmann, also known as the Hottentot Venus, who was a spectacle in Paris proper. Ulrika, a Senegalese girl who was purchased and gifted as a house pet to a French noble family, and Jeanne Duval, who was the common law wife of poet Charles Baudelaire. And what I found was that all these women had been manipulated in sometimes various different ways. What they had in common was a certain kind of illegitimacy at ever being part of the French body politic. So that even though theoretically each woman I write about gets closer and closer to whatever this elusive Frenchness is, that they could never be French. And also that French national identity changed, it's changing throughout this time, but the fantasies and the trauma imposed on these bodies are consistent in the sort of white certitude that bodies like this can never be French. So these women had been talked about before and talked about beautifully in some cases, but what I had seen is they had never been brought together into a more in-depth conversation about what they might tell us about France itself.
Thank you, Robin. First of all, let me also say a big thank you to Susan, Masha, and Rachel for organizing this series. It is truly a genius idea in these really very difficult times. I'm also very honored and grateful that I was the one who was chosen to be Robin's interlocutor. Robin, I simply could not put down your book, and actually that sort of presented a little bit of a dilemma for me. Because usually when you're reading books for scholarship, there's a certain amount of note-taking that happens that interrupts the process of reading, and that's okay, right? But in the case of your book, there was this wealth of information, historical, bibliographic, anecdotal, etc., and I had to keep taking notes down, and I found that interruption really bothersome because I just wanted to turn the page and keep reading. And part of it is because, the stories of these 3 women are so compelling, but also because you tell their stories so masterfully, and so my first question should be about you and the origin story of how you came, how this book came to be about these 3 specific women, Sarah Bartmann, Ulrika, and Jeanne Duval. And of course, I think you mentioned somewhere in your book that you wrote, you did your master's level work on Bartmann, but
yes.
How Ulrika and Jeanne Duval get added to that. And of course, the corollary is that, is there anybody else that you sort of wanted to talk about? But, as scholars, we have to make these choices sometimes, or did you have to set them aside or leave them out? So that's my first question to you.
Okay, well, I saw Dr. Lowry Martin come in, and we went to graduate school together, so I apologize in advance, Lowry, that you have to hear this again. But I actually began my graduate study in my graduate school thinking about that I was going to study Josephine Baker. So I thought I was going to do an episode American expatriate.
Yeah,
And
she shows up in your conclusion, right? I mean,
exactly. And not everybody, I think, so far quite understands why, but part of it was, you know, I was fascinated by both the marketing of her in France and how that she's also some kind of racial marker for people who spoke about Black people in France. I'd read a terrible, I have to say, terrible biography about her. And in it, there is a section in the book that is talking about the first time that Josephine Baker is about to go on stage for the Banana Dance, something that will make her famous around the world. And so they have a French producer come in to see if the show works. And he comes in, he sits down, he's looking at rehearsals, and he says something to the effect of this. I'm not sure if I have the exact quote. He says, "We need tits." He says, these French people with their fantasies about Black girls, we have to show them the tits. And I remember thinking at that moment, what fantasies of Black girls? And so I started wondering if Josephine Baker is just calling out, you know, the representation, I should say, of Josephine Baker is calling out to earlier sort of fantasies that white French men and women had about Black bodies. And so I started down this route of trying to find other women, and it took me backward earlier into the 20th century and then into the 19th century. And that led me to Sarah Bartmann. And as soon as I found her, it helped me understand the obsession with Baker in a new kind of way. And so I started reading other 19th century historians, and it was interesting to me that there were these moments where Blackness pops up. And it's not always specifically Black women, but reading other 19th century novels and things like that where Blackness pops up, and I thought, no, I'm not really seeing a lot of people write about how Blackness is working here and how it's not only racialized, but it's also gendered. And then so from there, I thought, I want to know as much as I can. So I started looking through the archives for any mention of Black women. And surprise, surprise, I found quite a few of them. And after that, I didn't think about anything else. Bartmann became the subject of my master's thesis and then my dissertation. That led me to Ulrica, and then that led me to Jean Duval. And I had heard of them, but I didn't really understand why initially I didn't understand why they were so important to my work. And then I realized, oh my God, even when Duval is alive in the mid to late 19th century, they're still having conversations about Bartmann. They're still having conversations about this little Senegalese girl, and they're still having conversations about Haiti. And so putting them together sort of changed everything for me. And so I had initially thought I was going to write about 4 women, and I only wrote about 3. And there are a couple of reasons why. She will come in the next work that I'm working on, but I had planned on starting the book with Suzanne Simone Baptiste, the wife of Toussaint Louverture. And the reason that I thought I was going to start there, it's interesting that she was going to be the first chapter and I found her last. That reading books on Toussaint Louverture, no one seemed to really care about his wife, except for Toussaint Louverture and his family. Biographers seem to be really very narrowly focused on Toussaint sort of as a hero and not as this human being who had this family that was also kidnapped alongside of him. And so I came across a letter that was purported to be written by Suzanne, claiming that she had been tortured under Napoleon at the same time her husband was being tortured. And so I started doing research on it. And one, I realized it was going to take a lot longer than I wanted to hold this book up. But the main reason why she's not in this book is because of the work that we do like this, and that it is often traumatic. Reading the letter about Suzanne was incredibly painful. It is detailed about these terrible kinds of trauma gleefully inflicted upon her body to tell another kind of story. And as I was reading it and getting into it, and then someone told me, oh, this reminds me of Saint Beatrice when her, you know, her breasts are cut off with hot pokers, and that's in this letter. And I had to stop. There's so much trauma here as well as joy, but the trauma was real throughout the writing. And I said, she needs to be the last chapter of the next book.
It's interesting that you talk about the trauma because, I mean, I wasn't going to ask this question today, but, you know, you start your book off actually by, with the day that you sort of discovered Sarah Bartmann's cast. And it sounded like, sort of reading through it, that was also sort of traumatic in some ways, right, for you. But
yeah.
You moved on. Yeah.
It absolutely was, only because, you know, there's the work that we do, and then there's sort of the bureaucracy of how we do it. And so here I am, I'm in Paris. I don't have the first clue of what I'm doing. You know, they told us, go to the archives and play in them, you know, whatever that means. And so I thought, I have no idea what I'm doing. And so I sort of put off going to the archives. And I knew that that Sarah Bartmann's body and her genitalia and her brain had been repatriated back to South Africa. I didn't know if there was anything left. And so, you know, one day and just in this crazy fit of courage, I thought, just go. And so I did nothing that I was supposed to do correctly. You know, I didn't have my pictures. I didn't have my letter from Berkeley. I had nothing. And I just marched in there. And it's sort of interesting how the universe responds to a made up mind, because the only person there was the senior curator and the only one who could give me any kind of access to her.
Yeah, and he sounded pretty sympathetic, actually.
Oh my God, he was delightful and wonderful and so kind to me. I think I had built up the archive in such a ridiculous kind of way, but you know, I thought, this is, you know, historians are professional. This is what they do. And then here I am crying. And I couldn't stop. I could not stop crying. It was sort of seeing something that I'd only seen in pictures and in books, but it was also the notion that the body cast was most likely the last thing that touched her. And so that, for me, I sort of got to do that by just sitting next to her and saying, you know, look, I'm going to do my best here. I don't know if it's going to work out, but it was really profound for me. It changed everything about how I thought about archives, how I thought about the work, how I thought about myself. And it fundamentally shifted sort of, I'm going to tell the story that I'm going to tell. And it may not look like what anybody thinks it's supposed to, but I'm going to tell the story that I want to tell. And from there, that gave me a lot of courage.
Yeah, and you mentioned the word archives. Of course, you're a historian, right? You mentioned the word archives a few times just now. And I wanted to touch upon a little bit on the sort of the theme of archival silence that runs through your book. But let me back up a little bit, because on the one hand, there's like a plethora of texts and images and stuff about these women, and what you yourself call, like, at least in the case of Bartmann, and even to some extent in the case of Ulrika, their hyper visibility, right? But on the other hand, there are basic forms of information that are just fundamentally missing, right? Jeanne Duval may have been born in 1820. Her
Exactly.
may have been so and so. Sarah Bartmann perhaps got married when she was in England, but we don't really know, right? And then there's the other kind of silence, which is the silence of their voices. That struck me a lot in your book is that the one recorded thing that was written about, that Sarah Bartmann is recorded to have said is just one word, which is no, right? No to Cuvier, despite the fact that apparently she spoke many languages, right? So for me, it was actually kind of incredible to read that your first chapter is actually entitled The Biographies, which I think is an incredibly scholarly, brave thing to do, right? How do you write biographies? You create these really credible, compelling biographies of these three women in the face of, on the one hand, complete archival silence, right? And on the other hand, this plethora of information and text and images, which are sort of suspect a little bit.
Absolutely.
So could you talk a little bit about how that, that challenge and how that worked?
Well, you're right. The archives are often silent to this, and often silent to the stories that are interesting to me. But what I found out is that we can gain something in the archives from people who are simply talking shamelessly about whatever they're talking about, and that there are these interesting slippages. There's these moments, like Cuvier isn't telling the story about her not letting him see her genitalia because he's proud of that. He should be horrified that he asked her, but he's not. And so he's sort of going, well, and while I was, I tried to do that, we offered her this, she wouldn't do it, and then I thought, wait a minute, she just said no. She just said no. And it was a moment where I had to sort of step back, because fundamentally I felt like I had failed in this book. When I started writing the book, I thought it's going to be about these women, and it's going to be about them talking, and it's going to be about them sort of moving through these spaces. And I have no from Bartmann. I have like a signature from Ulrika, and I have sort of all of this stuff about Duval. And so they're not speaking at all. And I thought, okay, wait a minute. And I had to sort of step back and say, these women take up space on French landscape. People see them, they interact with them. The idea that Jeanne Duval had a patisserie that she loved, like, changed my life, because I thought, I've got her walking down a street. I don't know where she stopped, but I've got her walking out of a building now, and she could have gone left or she could have gone right, but she was there, and people saw her and they interacted with her. And to act like these women had no contact with white French men and women felt really problematic to me. And so it was sort of like, was it devastating that I couldn't hear them speak as much as I wanted? Yes. But it was also that when they did speak, they sort of packed a punch. I love the fact that all we hear is no. The one moment where she was like, you've been looking at me and staring at me, and I've been painted and poked and prodded, and I still said no, right? That for me was amazing. But the archives are often silent, but I don't think they're unnecessary, because what I discovered here is the part of what I'm doing is looking at the people, looking at these folks as if they're curiosities. Mm-hmm. And so it is about me, through the writing, allowing the gaze to turn around so that Bartmann and Ulrika and Duval are looking at these people. Mm-hmm. And so it's a fundamental power shift. Like, Baudelaire didn't care about him. As the only reason he's in this book is he got me to Duval, right? I didn't want to read his poems. I didn't want to read his letters. I did, but I didn't want to. He wasn't interesting to me. And so I was able in some ways to take his archive and turn it back upon itself. Like, I can only imagine what Duval thought of Baudelaire's whining to his mother about needing money. So I think the archives are important. I think they show us, they take a long time. If we do this kind of work, it's gonna take a long time, because they're not just sitting in a file somewhere. They're sort of spread out everywhere. But it is that France in the 19th century does not look the way so many people think it does.
Good point.
And how do we find that? Through the archives. And I found them through letters and every kind of ridiculous rumor mongering and everything else, and plays. And that's where I found some of these women. So archives are tough, but they're so important.
Yeah, and that sort of brings me to the most of the sources that you use when you write about these three women. I mean, when we before everybody came on Zoom, there was some sort of jocular talk about how you would fit perfectly at NCFS, and it had to do with footwear, and then Peggy's glasses, so it was sartorial. But there's another reason why you would fit perfectly with the NCFS crowd, is that the majority of the sources that you use, right, are literary representations and visual representations of these women, and these are the sources that we are sort of most accustomed to. The crowd here that's on the Zoom call. And not only that, you almost seem to, and what sort of struck me is that you almost seem to favor the logic of cultural production and cultural representation over the logic of historical chronology, right? So for instance, Ulrika predated Bartmann in real life.
Right.
But you choose to speak about Bartmann first and then Ulrika later because Ulrika sort of, the Ulrika mania or as a phenomenon happened after Bartmann.
Exactly.
Right? And so maybe sort of this is a moment for you to correct me about sort of the naive idea I have about the kind of work that historians do. But, you know, your book reminded me a lot of Sue Peabody's book, There Are No Slaves in France.
Wow, what a compliment.
It is in that it is about blacks in France, and it's not about the colonies, right? It's about you know, and she also does these case studies of blacks in France, you know, when kind of like you do, but you know, Peabody's sources seem more traditionally sort of what I think of a historian as doing. They're ledgers, they're, you know, police records, they're court cases of black folks that, you know, sort of demanded their freedom. Whereas in your case, it's poems and plays and visual representations. And I was just wondering if sort of you could comment a little bit on how you see yourself as a historian, right? I mean, you are a historian. I mean, that's kind of perhaps not a...
No, it's fine. I'm really happy where I'm situated.
Yeah. So it's sort of like you know, you're in a history department. But you fit completely well in this crowd. You know, almost if I hadn't seen your sort of, you know, I would have like, oh, does she work in the literature department?
No, because the literature I read is terrible. I mean, these plays are terrible. One of the things that Darcy Grigsby taught me at Berkeley was that you can read images as text. So to me, there's no difference in looking at a painting and reading it than it is looking at a document and reading it, right? So I approached all the things that I saw as, how do I make this literate? Because a lot of the images that I looked at are trying to make themselves clear to people who can't read, right? They're looking at people who are going to go see a play on a Friday night, not going to go see an opera. They're going to go see a bad play. And then they're going to go to, you know, they're going to go have drinks somewhere. They're looking at silly graphics that I wanted to use things that people were actually sort of using. It's more difficult to sort of talk more globally when you've got maybe a painting that 3 people look at. I wanted to investigate the bad plays written about Ulrika. And that's what's so exciting about the work that I get to do, is that it doesn't need to be real to be historical or for me to write about it, right? As soon as someone throws something down, if there's a black face in it, it's mine, right? And so I wanted to see what people were seeing and reading and talking about. And so with the Ulrika plays during Ulrika Mania, they're terrible. I think one of them lasted a night, but that wasn't the point for me. The point for me was somebody needed to have this conversation, and they also thought French men and women needed to see that conversation. So for me, I'm proudly a pop culture nerd. I love it. I love it in the 21st century. I loved it in the 20th. I love it in the 19th century. I like those weird moments where you go, why in the world would they name a ham after a black woman? Like, what are you doing right now? For me, that was really horrifying and sort of exciting at the same time. And so the biographies that I did, I want to return to that because, you know, Crace and Scully have written a beautiful biography of Bartmann. I couldn't have gone near that book to write it, but I was trying to say that their contemporaries in France knew things about them. Mm-hmm. They might not have known much, and we don't know much, but they knew enough about them that they could have written another story.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
Right. And so it's sort of like, I wanted to be able to say that, you know, Baudelaire says to his friend, you know, Jean and I will be at dinner, because she was invited to dinner. Like, I don't know what happened there. I wish I did. Right. But what I wanted was this idea that the people around the women that I write about had people around them who had people around them who had people around them. Right. And they were talking. And so if Jean Duval comes up as Jean and Charles are coming to dinner, that she wasn't this creepy little doll that he kept stuck in the house. She went places with him. She did those things with him. And so I wanted, and those people were writers and artists. So I went to the source. And so it was interesting to me not to be in a position, thank God, of having to sort of review some of these plays, like, you know, the Venus Hottentotter Hatred of French Women. It's a terrible play. But that wasn't the point. The point was, in the play, he says, all of these white French women are now dressing like Sarah Bartmann. And I thought, what anxiety are you working out right now?
Yeah.
Right? Or someone says, I'm going to write a letter about how Napoleon is misbehaving, but I'm going to pretend it's a Black woman talking. And that to me was sort of fascinating. And most of those kinds of conversations came out through popular culture. They came out through literature. And then I was also curious about the fact that when 21st century folks were talking about these same sources, that in order to talk about them, they sometimes had to remove the Black woman from the image to have a conversation about it. And I thought, okay, really?
Yeah. And talking about removing Black women from the image, I originally started thinking I should ask one serious question about each of these three women, but we're coming up on the 2:40 mark, and I know Rachel is going to jump in for a question, so I'm just going to ask one question, and that's sort of it's appropriate because I feel like it brings us to the present. And it's really about Sarah Bartmann, you know. So in 2019, the Musée d'Orsay had this exhibit, right, called Le Modèle Noir, which was really about doing a little bit the kind of work that you're doing, trying to reconstruct the stories of who these Black models were for French painters, right, and with very, very, very scant archival sort of evidence. And the things that sort of struck me in that entire exhibit, which started, you know, with the Portrait d'une Négresse. Actually, that was one of the first paintings that showed up in 1800 and then went all the way up to Matisse, is that Sarah Bartmann was completely missing from that exhibit, right?
Yes, sure.
And after having read your book, it made me think a little bit about you use the word hypervisibility in the 19th century when you talk about her, and she was essentially invisible from this exhibit in the 21st century. And your book is really about Frenchness. I mean, what these Black women say, you know, what about, and I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on Frenchness today, and what does it mean for this exhibit to completely miss her out? Is she some sort of shameful memory? Is it like a memoir of Foulée? I sort of, that came back to me from.
It's a really good question, because I saw the same exhibit in Paris right before it was going to close. And I also noticed that she was missing, even though when the South Africans took her home, they left the paintings that had been done of her. So the paintings of her are in Paris. They're literally down the road. They're at the Musée de l'Homme, right? And then during the reconstruction, during the reorganization of the musée, they moved it to they went to the Jardin des Plantes. So they were sitting literally near the auditorium where Cuvier had her painted, right? So they're in Paris proper. And so I also thought about that. And I thought about this notion that, do certain kinds of Blackness need to be missing to see Frenchness, even if Blackness is sort of right there? And so I also found the whole exhibit, I'm going to expose myself here. On the one hand, I was like, wow, we're all in here consuming Black bodies. And then I ran to the books, you know, the gift shop, and bought everything. So I'm sounding a little bit hypocritical here, but at the same time, it's like, what kind of Blackness can we show? And a lot of the images are a way of distancing Frenchness from them. Like I felt like in some ways Frenchness was sort of looking again. Part of me was really happy that they started out with Madeleine, the Portrait d'une Négresse, because she's glaring at you. Like, I stood there and looked at her for so long, and having studied her a bit, and this idea that her mistress thinks she can expose her breasts and just paint her because she wants to know about white, is about also Madeleine glaring at her. silently, but staring. There's none of these moments where she's sort of looking up into she's looking at you. And there's something really powerful about that. The other thing that I thought was interesting that was missing from that exhibit is when you walk in, Courbet's painting is the first thing you see before you go through the gates, but it wasn't part of the exhibit. And that's the one where Duval has been removed.
She was erased from it, right?
Yes. I walked over and, again, it's one of those kinds of things that I've been doing my work and I hadn't gotten to see these paintings, right? Mm-hmm. And so there's Courbet on the wall and it's massive. Mm-hmm. And I walked right up to her. I saw exactly where she was. And in a painting that big, she's so easy to spot. And I thought, did anybody notice that you have this painting right here? And it sort of said everything to me about sort of hypervisibility. At the same time, there's a need for invisibility.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you for that. On that note, I'm just going to check with Rachel if she wants to jump in and start taking in the questions from the chat, because I was told that 2:40 is my sort of drop dead.
Oh dear.
But in the meantime, I think I might just pick up one of the questions that were actually asked in the chat. And there's Lauren Lee who's asking if, and I wanted to ask about Ulrika as well, so we might as well sort of jump in. I especially appreciated your characterization of the novel Ulrika. Could you describe what value, if any, that works like this one have, works in which white authors adopt an imagined Black voice? How can they be properly contextualized and interpreted? And in fact, you call that racial ventriloquism, right?
Yes.
And I thought that I could sort of begin with that question. And
the novel is so fascinating to me, only because someone else had said, this is the first time that a European has entered the Black mind. And I remember reading that and throwing the book across the room. And so it took me a while to get back to it, because the arrogance of thinking that one can enter the mind of anyone, I thought was so problematic. But again, with the novel, you see Duras' anxiety about being a colonial. And you also see how people responded to her writing this by saying, well, she's from the colonies. Mm-hmm. And so that there was something at stake for her in writing that. I also figured, the men who write about Ulrika is if she's some hypersexual being who only wants to have sex with whiteness. And if she can't, she goes crazy or she gets sick and she dies. Mm-hmm. And so on the one hand, Duras is doing this really interesting kind of thing where she is starting to hint at the kind of life that Ulrika will have. And then she sort of pulls her punches and says, oh, well, it's because she's in love with her brother and she can't marry him. Mm-hmm. And so we don't feel sorry for her anymore because she's pouting. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right? So I thought it was very telling about whiteness more than I did about Blackness when I read it. I also thought it was, I'm not going to say it wasn't an important work. I think it is an important work. But
you mean Ulrika?
Yeah, but I think it often sort of tells on itself. Mm-hmm. And I think it tells on itself with Ulrika mania. Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting, Ulrika, you talked about sort of consumerism and how we ourselves are kind of sort of at the Model Noir, we bought everything in the gift shop, right? I remember myself doing the same thing. But in that vein, and sticking with Ulrika and the colonies, I thought I wouldn't have any question to ask about Ulrika, scholarly hubris, I suppose. I thought there was everything I needed to know about Ulrika. I knew about the fashion, the plays, etc. But then I found out reading your book that I actually didn't know something, and that is the Café Ulrika that in Lyon, right?
Yeah.
And to me, what struck me about that, there was actually this cafe named Café Ulrika in Lyon, and that they sort of sold it or marketed it as you will be served by 2 African women, right?
And male Ulrikas.
So they're not male Ulrikas, and the sugar, right? I mean, the metaphor of the sugar will look sweeter and whiter, so from their sort of their hands, right? And
Yeah.
just wondering about, how long did that cafe last, first of all?
I don't know. Denise
Was there-
Davidson wrote about the cafe first.
Mhm.
And I tried really hard finding information out on that cafe and couldn't go beyond her sources.
Mhm.
But again, it was that sort of moment for me when you're reading it, when they sort of start talking about it. It's like for the shy ones, you know, you can go to Cafe Urca. And I thought, oh my God, they just brought the empire home
Mhm.
for you. Those who can't go to the colonies can have this colonial experience in France proper.
Yeah. And
So I don't know how long it lasted.
and was there any blowback at all from like the abolitionists of the time, or was there any polemic at all about the Café Urca? Or
You know, maybe it's not a harder question. Here's the thing about French abolitionists is most of them are killed in the terror. And so Britain always has a more robust abolitionist presence than France does. So, you know, we see with Sarah Bartmann, the court case about whether she's being held against her will happens in England. It doesn't happen in France. France is like, woohoo, let's go, right? And so there is less of an abolitionist presence in France than there were, I'd say, clearly in Britain, but even other spaces, because those folks are dead. And, you know, the real Urca, as much as I could try to recreate her, you know, is dead by 1799. Right. So I felt like going through the book that every name had to be in quotes all the time, because I was like, Bartmann did this and Bartmann didn't do that. Right. And so I don't know what the response was. I have a feeling from looking at Davidson's book and the small amount of research I was able to do on that is that it was sort of a fad, like all of these other things.
Fads, right? Yes, short-lived. Yeah. So there are more questions coming into the chat, and Rachel is going to jump in right now. So Rachel.
Okay, coming.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm not as good at reading and talking as Andrew Counter was somehow magically last time. So bear with me. And you're getting a lot of love in the chat, Robin. So I hope you'll.
Oh my gosh, please print it out so I can have the love.
Yes, we will furnish that. And I think that, you know, really comes from a lot of us teach Urca as scholars of 19th century. And I personally teach it in a class called France and Its Others, for which the theme really is, you know, that French exploration of the other is so much about France and not the other, right? This is not the way you learn about what a cannibal is, for example, or a Persian. And the same for Urca, and it's really been challenging knowing that there was an actual Urca to teach that text in that context. And so I'm just personally so appreciative of this work that allows us, that is just this essential reframe that I think some of us have been sort of wanting and not knowing exactly, you know, where it came from. So it just opens up so much in terms of our own teaching, and I think and thinking. And so I think so many of us are sort of sitting here with our synapses firing, you know, speechless really, but excited to be able to integrate this into the classroom.
Well, even Dura has questions about Haiti come from Urca, right? Urca is the one who's like, people are being killed over there by these savages, and suddenly I'm ashamed of who I am. You know, that's a moment lost. It's Urca who says that, not anyone else in that circle. And so it's so frustrating to me throughout all the women that I study, that nonsense comes out of their mouth. But people need that nonsense to come from them, not from themselves. So you're right. You're learning, I hope, just as much about Frenchness in the 19th century as you are about these small pockets of women that I don't know that much about, because they show up and sometimes they stay for a while and sometimes they leave really quickly. You know, in the case of Duval, she lives her life in France because, you know, hello, she's French, right? So there's these kinds of moments where anxieties sort of come out and with Ulrika, it does. You know, she's talking about black beasts and her shame.
Right, but
black bodies.
Yeah, but at the same time, as much as we can sort of recognize that in terms of the authorship of the text, you're also just profoundly reminding us of the humanity of this person who was there. And that's the thing that, you know, that silence that we have, it's so easy to just glide right past. So, and so this is really just such an important work in terms of giving us the space in which to think about that. So in terms of some of the questions that are coming in the chat, you feel like the figures you look at inspire the desire for the presence of Black women in brothels. This is part of relating to the Modèle Noir exhibit, and white men looking at an image of women in a brothel, which was included to show the presence of a Black woman as fille publique. You can probably see these questions also.
No, I can't. I'm purposely not
okay.
in the chat.
Okay.
Okay.
Is this part of a different history of eroticization of difference?
Interesting. It's interesting, you know, I'm looking at later 19th century images where Black women do, you know, a Black woman does appear to sort of locate the other women. But I'm looking at a small book right now from 1790 that says it's supposed to be about where the young Frenchmen can find prostitutes, les bordels du Paris, and it's got an entire section that is like, and by the way, there's this brothel of Black women. So they're telling you, if this is what you're desiring, you can go there specifically. So I think there's a change between sort of how one woman marks everyone and the fact that in the late 18th, early 19th century, there's this sort of understanding that some people desire Blackness and they can go straight to it. They don't have to talk it through a white body, right? So there's a change over time, which is how for me, why history works, about how sexuality and prostitution is sort of looked at in terms of different kinds of bodies in the beginning of the 19th century than it is later.
There was a question earlier that I kind of missed as the question started coming up that I thought would be interesting, because it talks a little bit about Cuvier, and you talk quite a bit about Cuvier in your Bartmann chapter. Could you say more about the role of French institutions in the creating of scientific racism? Before discussions of Sarah Bartmann became mainstream, it seems to me that the role of Cuvier and the Académie des Sciences in the creation of European ideologies of white supremacy were downplayed compared to Darwin and company.
I might push back about that a little bit, you know, and at the same time, I'm saying that in many ways, Cuvier's reputation is solidified through Bartmann. He presents Bartmann's genitalia and basically says, now I understand Black female sexuality. And there are people coming from all over the world listening to that conversation and sort of spreading out going, okay, now we understand Black female sexuality. So there seems to be this notion of sort of lumping naturalists as, you know, and these were just one more of the species that they looked at. And that's really problematic for me, because Cuvier is so specific about wanting access to that body. He thinks it's going to tell him something. It's going to reveal some kind of secret he has not yet seen. And so when she dies, when Bartmann dies, he's almost gleeful about getting that body, because it's going to share something that only he is going to have access to, right? So at the same time, we can sort of talk about French institutions of science and scientific racism. There's also something very specific about this body. And that for me was sort of throughout the book. And whether you find it sort of compelling or not, but there's something about this Black female body that he wants access to tell him secrets that only he knows to the rest of the world, right? And so I always get a little bit nervous about sort of saying, and I think I said this, that I don't want science to be sort of separated from popular culture because they're feeding upon one another. It is him talking about her that lets the play happen. It happened, you know, Urca Mania happens because there are just like, there's secrets here. And if you go, you learn these secrets. And the plays suggest the same thing. The idea with Urca, you know, the Urca plays is, you know, she's a perfect French girl except for race. Everyone can see that. With the Bartmann play, it is about this Frenchman, this white Frenchman who decides that white French women are terrible because they've cheated on him. So he needs sort of this blank slate to write upon. And falls in love with an idea of her. And it's only when other white women come in and go, really, this is what she actually looks like, that he is somehow saved, right? That's coming from science as well. Like, all of these institutions are feeding off one another. I'm interested in how they play themselves out in different places. You know, Cuvier, not a fan. I hope that's clear in the book. But I had to really try to stay with what he thought he was saying versus what I was hearing, and they were not the same thing. And I think if you look at many of the scientific discussions around Blackness in the 19th century, you're going to see that sort of cognitive dissonance where it's like talking about this, and it's like, no, you're not. You're talking about this. So Cuvier was really interesting for me. You know, I visited his grave in Paris because I felt like I needed to, and I needed to tell him that Sarah outlived him in her usefulness, right? That we talk about her and often don't talk about him was really important to me to say.
Rachel, I have a question unless you want to jump in.
Okay, I just was another
Just
question.
Go ahead.
There's a question from Charlotte Fauché about whether images of Black women were disseminated abroad in imperial and non-imperial contexts as a way to speak about Frenchness to foreign audiences in the period that you look at.
Wow, that's a really great question. Yes, and actually not just images of them, but sort of the women themselves. Like, I'm now working on Suzanne Simone Baptiste, and it's really interesting to me how images of Suzanne are starting to pop up in the South United States for me. That they're having conversations about Suzanne Simone Baptiste in like Virginia and Georgia. It's really weird. And that the folks that are writing about them are writing about them to say, boy, these French are really awful. Look at this wonderful woman who's a good mother. And I'm like, why are you talking about a Black woman as a good mother at the moment of slavery in the United States? Like, what are you doing? And so I think in certain cases, these women are being useful to talk about Frenchness and sort of French barbarism. Like, I find the work that I'm doing with Suzanne right now really interesting in that it is part of the story. The narrative is about making Napoleon look benevolent at a moment when he's reinstituting slavery throughout the colonies, right? So there are certain stories that just sort of push out. Bartmann is probably the best example because of the fact that Cuvier has been talking to scientists from America, from Germany. So I've got really weird images throughout Europe and part of the United States that I'm not really quite sure what to make of yet. But Bartmann has staying power. Like, there's a rumor that there's another Hottentot Venus that happens after her. And I don't know if it's actually another woman or if they're just keeping the ghost of Sarah alive throughout the 19th century. So these images pack a lot of punch no matter where they are.
So Pratima, I think one last question and then I'll have to wrap up.
Oh, it's my. Yeah, sorry. This is like the comedy of errors of Zoom. Right? I had my question. Yeah, there's so many of them, and I don't know which one to choose. But the question I was going to ask you, I think it was Mike Garval's question. If you wondering if you have anything to say about the images of Black women in French advertising from late 19th into 20th century France. I mean, it's good because you started off with Baker, right? So in some ways, Rome Negrita or the Antillaises, who precedes the Tirailleur Sénégalais as the branded character representing Bananières. So, yeah.
Yeah, I've been looking at a lot of those images, and I thought I was actually going to stay with the rum ads and all of those ads at a certain point. That's a little bit harder for me to answer, I think. I hate to end on a question where I go, I don't know. But I think here, I'm going to tweak this question a little bit in terms of French advertising to talk about a cafe that I saw the last time. It's closed now. There was a cafe that opened up called La Femme Noire in Paris. And I found it through how they were advertising the cafe, you know, through their matchbooks and things. And so that, and then there was another one. I went to a cafe on the left bank, and a very chic cafe, and we went into the bathroom and started washing our hands, and a naked Black woman popped up in the mirror. That, you know, I'm to the point now where sort of images about and images of Black women pop up in these just really bizarre spaces. And so I don't concern myself that much with the later 19th century right now, because I'm moving backward. Like any good historian, I started out in the 20th century and now I'm playing in the 18th century. And so I can't talk really clearly about what later 19th century advertisements look like. But the ones that I'm finding in the 18th century are quite fascinating.
Great. And I think that also answers our question about changes in representational modalities in the 21st century France. So on that note, well, I want to thank you both so much. And I know I'm not alone in totally appreciating this conversation, because the chat is just full of appreciation. And so we'll, you know, anyone who wants to stick around, turn cameras back on. We hope to see you. I hope to see you in about a month on October 23rd. You can reach us on the Gmail, and thank you so much for being a part of this great little bubble where we don't talk about the horrible things going on outside the bubble.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Yeah.
Thank you, Pratima.
And thank you, Robin, for sort of this beautiful book and curating it the way you did for us. I mean, I think Rachel used the perfect word. It's a reframe, you know, and that's the feeling I had when I, so thank you so much.
Thanks.